Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the July installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series. Today's session is titled The Resurgence of Rural America with our speakers, Dr. Basil Gooden and Mike McKenzie. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts free virtual events like this monthly. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement here at the Wilder School. Before we start, I'd like to share a few updates and announcements. We're excited to announce that we are rising in our rankings. U.S. News World and Report, U.S. News and World Report now ranks the Wilder School as the #1 graduate program in public affairs in Virginia and top 15% of the nation. We are number 35 in the nation among public affairs graduate schools and have the 29th ranked public management and leadership program. We are so proud to be at the forefront of our field. Featured here are the application deadline for our award-winning Master of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness program, which is online. The application deadline is July 25th. Please contact Ross Lasempio if you have any questions. And last thing, the spring 2022 edition of our Wilder School in Action magazine is now available online. Now, a word from Dr. Susan Gooden, Dean and Professor of the Wilder School for Government and Public Affairs, who will introduce our moderator.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Delighted to see so many folks online here for our July Lunch and Learn. As Stephen mentioned, this is a signature event at the Wilder School and a way for us to bring very timely topics and fresh perspectives from within the community, both nationally and within the state, to discuss topics that are important and are front of mind for many of us. I know today's session will be focused on rural America, and certainly there's a lot of things to be learned there and a lot of work to do. I do want to say briefly that in regard to the HSEP deadline, I do want to mention that we do not require standardized tests for the graduate program. That was something that was dropped a couple of years ago. And so I do want to mention that for folks who might be interested in applying or know folks who are interested in applying. There are lots of exciting things going on at the Wilder School. And if you're not already part of our Policy Bites distribution list, I invite you to reach out to us so that we can add you there. That comes out every other week, and we provide information on very relevant policy research and findings that are coming from the Wilder School. And we hope that you find those resources and tools very useful, in addition to the tools that Stephen shared, such as Wilder School in Action. And now on to our event for this afternoon. So I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, who is Mike McKenzie. Mike is a member of the VCU Wilder School faculty. He leads our CURA Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, and also our LUEP program, which stands for Land Use Education Program. Of course, like all places, we love our acronyms. Prior to Mike joining us at the Wilder School at VCU, he was a researcher at Housing Opportunities Made Equal Home, and he led efforts in Virginia that contributed to a landmark settlement with Fannie Mae over discrimination in the maintenance of foreclosed homes in majority Black and Latino neighborhoods. Mike also is a graduate of the Wilder School. He earned his Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from us, and we're delighted that he's moderating this session with us this afternoon. Mike.
Thank you, Dean Gooden. And good afternoon, everyone. We're glad you could join us today. The COVID pandemic has changed how many of us work, live, and socialize. The growth in telecommuting has allowed many workers to save time and money by working at home. And the result has forced us to reconsider how we think about the relationship between home and work. It also raises some questions about local economies, such as what happens to an economy when certain types of work can be done from anywhere. In 2020, amid social distancing fears and city-centered protests of police violence and racism, some economists predicted workers would move away from densely populated cities. Rural communities stood to benefit. Joining us today to talk about the resurgence of rural America is Dr. Basil Gooden. Dr. Gooden serves as the Director of State Operations for Rural Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he helps guide federal policies to improve economic opportunity and quality of life in rural Virginia. Prior to his current appointment, Dr. Gooden was a visiting scholar in VCU's I-Cubed program, researching sustainable food access. Dr. Gooden also served as Virginia's Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry in the McAuliffe administration, the Virginia State Director of Rural Development at the USDA, the Chief Deputy Director at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Coordinator of Community Outreach at Virginia Tech. Dr. Gooden has a Ph.D. in social work and a master's degree in public health from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He received an MSW from Syracuse University and a BA in political science at Virginia Tech. Dr. Gooden grew up in Buckingham County, Virginia, where he owns and operates a cattle farm. Dr. Gooden, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And I want to thank the Wilder School as well for this opportunity to talk a little bit about rural America. And I will focus on rural Virginia with some examples as well. So what I wanted to do is briefly just give you an overview of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. The first goal of this presentation is to sort of get into what is rural America? How are we defining rural America? And talk a little bit about some of the demographics around rural America. The second goal is to actually explore some of the challenges that we have in rural America. And then the big part of this presentation, we will actually look at some solutions and some strategies and some successes across the country, but I'm going to focus more so on Virginia with some examples of some of the successes here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk about in the presentation. And before we get started with the presentation, I did want to share with you that I think a lot about rural America, not only in my current position or my previous position as Secretary of Agriculture, or my time with Department of Housing and Community Development. Really, those agencies, organizations really worked in rural America across the state of Virginia. And it really was near and dear to me, but I think a lot about rural America. And I'll tell you what drives my thinking around rural America. Very quickly, I'll share a story with you that I always share when I was Secretary of Agriculture. But really, why I am so committed to rural America is actually I grew up in a rural area, as Mike has indicated. And actually, when I was trying to decide where to go to school, go to college, it came down to actually two choices. I was trying to decide between University of Virginia and Virginia Tech. And my guidance counselor actually called me into her office when I was trying to make that decision. And she said, Basil, I just have a piece of advice for you. City boys go to the University of Virginia. Country boys go to Virginia Tech. And so I ended up going to Virginia Tech. But the real story is I learned something on my first day at Virginia Tech. I didn't know a soul in Blacksburg, Virginia. I didn't know anybody. My first day in Blacksburg, my father took me to Virginia Tech along with my brother. And actually, they dropped me off there at Virginia Tech. And as my father was leaving, I'd gotten everything out. As my father was leaving, he told me three things. He said, hey, stay out of trouble. I said, okay, that's fine. He said, hey, get good grades. I'm like, okay, great. I think I can do that. But the third thing he told me as he was leaving, is really what shook me and woke me up to rural America. My dad said as he was leaving, he said, and don't focus on coming back to the country. Essentially, he said, don't come back to the country. And then he followed that up by saying, you go where the opportunities are. You go to where the jobs are. There are no jobs in the country, and the country being rural America. And so that shook me to the core, to hear that. Don't come back to the place that I grew up and I know and I love. So I really think a lot about rural America and certainly rural Virginia in my work day in and day out. So we'll go ahead with the presentation. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about how are we defining rural America. They're actually in the government, there are more than 10 definitions of what's considered rural. But according to Elizabeth Davis, and again, she's one of our researchers, ag researchers in the USDA Economic Research Services, certainly rural is a very fluid concept, but generally, to be quite candid, once we go through the data, generally rural is defined by what is not urban. But essentially, there are two concepts that are a part of defining what is called rural. Looking at the census blocks and the tracts and the zip codes, but really looking at what is, and looking at the population in these census blocks and the zip codes, but also looking at what is the concept or the concept or the criteria for determining what is urban and rural. And in some programs in the federal government, the definition is, does it feel rural? And so rural is a very tough definition all the way around. But we'll get more into that. The next slide, please. So according to the Office of Budget and Management, the 2013 census, and again, this is a snapshot because when I put this presentation together, we used the 2020, the 2020 census had not been finalized yet. But this is a map of what's called non-metropolitan counties, and those are the rural areas. And this may be a little difficult to see. Actually, this presentation will be with the Wilder School, so you can request it if they do share these presentations. And then the metropolitan areas are the lighter areas, and then the urbanized are the darker areas. Next slide, please. So what's a little bit different about urban areas as compared to rural areas? Actually, rural areas as compared to urban areas. Certainly, there are fewer people, fewer density. In 2020, 14% of the US population lived in rural America. Again, around 46 million people. It's defined by slower population growth. Again, those are the numbers there. The metropolitan areas grew from 2000 to 2010, more than 10%, nearly 11%. Rural areas grew around 4.5% during that same time frame. And from 2010 to 2020, rural areas lost population from 2010 to 2020, where metropolitan areas actually gained population. And again, rural areas tend to be a little older, and actually there's an out-migration of younger people from rural areas. Next slide, please. So just looking very briefly at the racial composition, rural areas tend to have a little less diversity. And again, I don't want anyone to think that rural America is monolithic, that it's all white, that we're all farmers. No, it's not that at all. Rural America does have diversity, However, it is not as diverse, as you can see from these pie charts, as metropolitan areas. Next slide, please. Wanted to very quickly get into some of the numbers around in rural America as compared to metropolitan areas. So in a lot of the rural areas, we do have what's considered persistent poverty counties. And persistent poverty counties, many of you know, are counties whereby at least 20% or more of their population is actually considered at the federal poverty line or below. And they have been in that situation for 4 consecutive censuses. So going back to 1980, areas with more than 20% poverty below the federal poverty line are considered persistent poverty areas. That's important to know because these persistent poverty areas, both in rural areas and in urban areas, actually are more susceptible to negative impacts related to healthcare, education, social justice. So you'll see a little bit of that in this presentation as well. But looking at this graph, again, it tells a little bit about where some of the persistent poverty counties are really overrepresented in rural areas. Many of the rural counties throughout the South, where you have a high population of minorities, people of color, also experience persistent poverty in these areas as well. A lot of the tribal communities out in the Midwest actually considered persistent poverty areas. And what we saw there was that the COVID impact as well, we'll talk a little bit about that, actually was far more damaging in these persistent poverty areas. So rural areas have far more persistent poverty areas as compared to the metropolitan areas. Next slide, please. Wanted to talk a little bit about what states saw the highest influx of population to the rural counties, and which states actually saw the greatest loss of folks as well. So this graph, this chart just shows that West Virginia actually lost the most population between 2010 and 2020 census. North Dakota actually in its rural areas gained about 12.5% of population. And that's primarily due to its natural resources, to the oil and the energy boom in North Dakota and some of the states out in the Midwest. Next slide, please. So wanted to talk very briefly about the impact of COVID, how it impacted some of these rural areas as compared to the metropolitan areas. What this chart is actually showing is that when we look at the rural areas, but if we look at the persistent poverty areas in these rural areas, that line is that brown line. That is the line where we saw more COVID cases in the persistent poverty counties in rural America, and actually more hospitalizations and more deaths in the persistent poverty counties in rural America. The other line, the metropolitan persistent poverty areas actually increased as well. They were far higher than the non-persistent poverty counties in both the urban and the rural counties as well. So they experienced far worse health outcomes in these persistent poverty counties in these rural areas. Next slide, please. Then also wanted to look at unemployment, and suffice it to say, what this graph indicates that again, looking at the metropolitan area, actually in the persistent poverty area, had the highest unemployment because we feel that that had a lot to do with the service industry, the tourist industry in some of the metropolitan areas. As you know, restaurants and all the tourist, attractions, they were shut down. A lot of the workers actually are in the persistent poverty areas in metropolitan areas, but also you will see too that the unemployment was pretty high related to the rural areas and the persistent poverty areas as well. Next slide. And finally, just wanted to talk a little bit about access to broadband, because as Mike indicated in the introduction, the workforce has changed, and a lot of companies are looking at how their employees can connect via broadband. And what this chart is showing, actually, it may be a little difficult to read, but we're looking at the rural areas that actually have home internet with a subscription, being able to get rural internet. We do know that some folks actually use internet on their mobile phone, but then the blue area is the part of both the rural and the urban areas that actually had no internet service. So again, what you're seeing in the persistent poverty areas in the rural counties, again, has very lack of access to broadband and internet, which again will impact their ability to work remotely, as we'll talk a little bit about when we get to some of these success strategies. So so if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we are looking at some of the archetypes, and looking at some strategies that we're using in rural America to actually develop communities and economic opportunities in these rural areas. What I'll do is actually go to the strategies themselves. Again, you'll have these slides, and so if in the interest of time, if we could go to the next slide, and what I wanted to do is do next slide. Okay, so all of these strategies, and what I want you to know is this is not a comprehensive list of all the strategies that can be utilized in rural America, that are being utilized in rural America, and it's not exhaustive at all. So these are just a snapshot based on the work of Rural Rising, Economic Development Strategies for America's Heartland, and wanted to focus on that because they've done some work with USDA. And I do want you to note that these comments are not representative of USDA. These are my observations and my interpretations of the data that we do get on a daily basis. So overall, the strategies, just wanted to dive into them. The first strategy is, next slide, we can just go into. The first strategy is the big push investment. Essentially, that's trying to land a very big business corporation to come into your area to actually impact the workforce. And the example that I use in this case here is when Microsoft actually went down to Mecklenburg, and they are in Mecklenburg, when a huge company comes to your town. That's called, again, sort of the big push strategy. The next slide, please. Placemaking. That is a strategy of looking at your assets, looking at the things that you can market and promote in your area. A lot of agencies across the Commonwealth of Virginia actually will help with placemaking, help communities with placemaking. What I did do is just pull out one example with the town of Christiansburg, actually a great placemaking opportunity there. And so again, if you have an opportunity to hop on the web, you can look more about what placemaking is, but essentially it's making an area, a region, a place that that people want to live, work, play, and learn as well. So that's placemaking. Also want to let you know that USDA has grants to help with technical assistance with placemaking. Next slide, please. Third strategy, to develop a tourism infrastructure. Now, this is a big one because a lot of the areas that have some type of recreation in these rural and rural parts of the country, whether it's, they have natural resources, whether they have parks, oceans, mountains, and things of that nature, or they have some assets that will be unique to that area, something that they can promote as a region or as a county. And the example that I pulled out here is the Shenandoah Valley, the Fields of Gold, which is, again, it's a regional agritourism program to market. So there are many of these programs across the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Crooked Road in Southwest Virginia. So again, many of these opportunities are across Virginia. Then strategy number 4, to attract remote workers. This is a big one because actually, as you know, the pandemic has really shifted the workforce. And so as the workforce is changing to a more of a remote posture, more and more people, actually skilled workers, are coming back to rural America to live. However, some are finding that the broadband infrastructure will not support the type of technology that they're requiring. So it will require localities, municipalities to make investments, but it also requires the federal government to make investments and the state government to continue to make investments in broadband as well. But also in attracting remote workers, we're looking at also incentives. How can we get more folks to come out to rural America? And there's some really neat programs across the country. And this is actually a non-Virginia program that I highlighted in this example, but the remote shoals actually in the Northwest Alabama, they're actually providing grant incentives of $10,000 for folks to come work and live in these regions, and you have to stay there for at least 12 months. And this program has just grown astronomically, trying to get more people into these regions. There are also student loan repayment programs with a lot of these municipalities to attract workers, certainly around the healthcare industry. And that's one of our final strategies. So if we can go to the next strategy, increase access to healthcare. So again, healthcare is critical across the country, but it is acutely an issue in rural America because of the lack of hospitals that, as compared to urban areas, far fewer hospitals, far fewer healthcare professionals. So again, a lot of the rural areas are in need of that, and there are a lot of incentives, certainly at the federal level, but also many philanthropies and nonprofit organizations are stepping up to provide incentives to try to get healthcare professionals actually into a lot of these medically underserved populations. And just the what I've indicated here is also telemedicine and telework, telehealth services, critically important to be able to reach rural America and rural Virginia. However, you do need to have some type of, again, infrastructure that will support what what is needed as far as from the hospital's side. One strategy that also I want to mention as well is the attraction of small and mid-sized businesses. That's one of the strategies, and I just don't have a slide here for that. But again, to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, or the focus on those smaller businesses, because as you know, about 65% of folks of employed individuals in rural America are actually employed by small and mid-sized companies. So really looking at incentives to support businesses, whether it's improving access to capital, whether it's providing technical assistance. So really a focus on small businesses. And also I do know that the Department of Housing and Community Development, they have the entrepreneurial ecosystem that actually that is designed to help provide resources and support for businesses out in rural Virginia. So with that, actually, I'll stop. And that was a lot of information. I'll stop and be happy to have a discussion about any of these strategies, to take questions about something I didn't cover in this overview. So again, thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gooden, for the look at rural America and the opportunities there for economic development, economic growth. I'll start out with a few questions here, and then we'll move on to the audience's questions, which are rolling in. And thank you all for asking questions. Please continue to enter those in the chat, and we will get to those as quickly as we can. Dr. Gooden, you mentioned your father's advice, and I'm reminded specifically of my own father, who grew up on an apple farm in the Shenandoah Valley. His family told him after he returned from college that there's no work for him there. And so I'm thinking about this idea of brain drain that we hear often as a barrier to business attraction in rural communities. And where educated people in these rural areas move to metropolitan areas after school to find work. And in an information-based economy, often that makes it hard to attract businesses. So it feels like a chicken and egg problem, where rural areas want to retain those workers without the related jobs, and they also want to attract the jobs without the workers. Do you have any thoughts on how rural areas can kind of move beyond rural communities, move beyond the paralysis that comes with that, to move beyond the issue of brain drain and kind of get at the workforce needs that they have rather than the ones that they want?
Right. No, thank you for the question as well. Mike, quite honestly, I feel that folks from rural America actually can sit anywhere and actually support rural America in various positions. Now, certainly we want the brain power in rural America to the work, especially if you're running a farm or something of that nature, you need the people there on the ground. But I am of the opinion, and I see it daily, that if we can convince people, regardless of where they live geographically, they can live in the urban area, but if they grew up and have some connection to rural America or rural Virginia, we can actually enlist them to help with some of the brain power, some of the thinking, and trying to help, grow these rural areas from which they've come. And so, sometimes I'm an example of that. I live here in Richmond, Virginia, but I do go back up to Buckingham County quite on a weekly basis. But I also solicit input from folks who don't go back to the rural area as much, but also talking about how we can invest back into these rural counties without actually sitting there in these rural counties. So really want to just use everybody that has some type of connection to these rural areas. Because it has been a challenge for decades to keep folks, especially young folks, in rural areas, and you can't blame them. I mean, you want them to go to where the opportunities are, and but don't forget about rural America when you do leave.
Thank you. You mentioned the resources, and I'm thinking about. I know a lot of rural communities have, in terms of planning staff, like 1 or 2 planning staff, just very few folks in working in the public sector in that end. And I'm curious how your thoughts are on how a lot of rural communities can move forward with economic development without the resources of a metropolitan area.
Right. It's extremely challenging. It's extremely challenging. You lose population, you lose, your tax base, and, you can't raise the taxes on the fewer people that are there. And so you really have to be creative. You have to look at a regional approach. You're going to have to look at other localities that are similarly situated with you. And thankfully in Virginia and across the country as well, many rural localities are able to form regional alliances. Certainly here in the state of Virginia, you have Virginia Go, which actually looks at regional approaches to economic development. So I've worked with many county administrators across Virginia, and there's a county administrator out in Carroll County, and he would work with all of the counties around, and just said, we just don't have the resources to do this by ourselves. Let's work together. And so you have to form the agreements and cost sharing agreements and revenue sharing agreements. So it has to be more of a regional approach. Especially when you have smaller population, you can't do it alone. So that's one strategy that has been successful for a lot of the municipalities across Virginia.
Thank you. Move on to a few of the audience's questions. The first question is, this morning's NPR had a story on Morning Edition about rural Americans feeling the effects of inflation greater than those in urban and suburban America. One point was made that the cost of fuel to get necessary services and lack of infrastructure for electric vehicles rurally kind of might hold economic growth back, and a concern that this person has is the availability of top healthcare. What are your reactions to those concerns?
Sure. I mean, often it's said, if there's a recession in America, the minority communities actually are, doubly impacted. If America has a cold, minority communities have a flu or pneumonia. It's almost similar with rural America. When inflation hits America or our country, it is felt in different ways in rural America. I'll tell you from personal experience, just running a farm. I mean, farm costs, fertilizer, just through the roof. Actually, hay to feed the animals. Last year, bale of hay was $40 a bale. This year, $75 a bale. That's what in Buckingham County, Virginia. And so that's, again, farmers are seeing it, agriculturalists are seeing it, businesses are seeing it. I went to a couple of restaurants where they had posted, hey, our costs are going up. So again, we have to pass these costs along. So inflation is something that many people are talking about. It's impacting their lives, impacting their decision-making. And so again, it's something that we have to use different strategies and different tactics, certainly in rural America, but in America in general, because again, I don't know the gist of the story from NPR, but it certainly is causing decisions. And again, you don't have the charging stations in some of these rural areas. That is something that USDA is focused on like a laser. There's funding, their infrastructures. Secretary Buttigieg is actually going across the country pushing charging station in rural areas. The president actually also put that in some of his relief packages as well. So again, trying to get some of these again resources out into the rural areas, but they're slow in coming. But no, it's felt all across the country, and certainly felt in rural areas, inflation.
And do any economic strategies stand out to you to help rural immigrant communities, which is kind of a growing demographic, especially in rural US and Virginia?
Yes. And again, I think it's a undercounted, underrepresented, underserved community. A lot of the immigrant populations, a lot of the Native American populations also underserved as well. And again, it's one of those things I don't think a lot of people realize that we are heavily reliant on immigrant population for our agriculture economy. Actually, the food that we eat primarily. And again, you saw that where it impacted in these rural areas with a lot of the meat packing plants that were actually shut down. And again, what you saw working in the meat packing plants, a lot of people of color, a lot of immigrants, a lot of women. And so it's a underrepresented and an underappreciated, in my opinion, population that deserves our full respect, our full support, and resources to help them with their wealth accumulation, to help them grow economically as well, and help with resources that will to buy homes and to build wealth within all of these communities, because that's what, again, we should be all about is, trying to help us all where it's fair and equitable for everyone, regardless of what your position is or what your, immigration status is. We should be in the business of helping those in need and looking to be self-sufficient. So yes, we need to do far more than what we're currently doing to address that workforce and that population. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think relatedly, I wanted to ask about, and this is related to some questions that some folks have posted. Pardon me for the city noise here. The housing situation in the US seems, broadly very difficult in terms of renting, in terms of buying for a lot of folks. And I wanted to ask, number one, how that translates in rural America, but also what some of the housing options might be in terms of are there more affordable options in rural areas that might attract folks from urban areas, or are there programs in place to help folks who might need housing assistance, and what are those eligibility requirements? So in terms of, I think, in terms of immigrants, are a lot of the immigrants in the US without documentation, are they eligible for some of these programs?
And to answer to your question, actually, it depends. It really depends as far as several things there. The eligibility, but also, but primarily for some of the federal programs, you have to be an American citizen or in that process. For most of the programs that I am aware of, there may be some out there, but it also depends as far as housing costs. There's a housing crisis across the United States. I mean, so rent is actually going up in rural areas as well. I mean, everything is sort of it's pervasive across the country. So what you see happening here is also is reflected in rural areas as well. So there is a housing crunch, but thankfully we have some great organizations here in the state of Virginia, the Department of Housing Community Development and Virginia Housing. They are focused like a laser. They are very innovative, those organizations, and many nonprofits. LISC, your previous organization as well, providing opportunities, housing opportunities. So it's a crisis across the country, and it does not evade rural America. So rural America has a housing crisis as well. As often, a lot of times people don't, think about it or realize that, again, that these things impact rural just as it's impacting these metropolitan areas. So yes, there's a housing shortage, and we need more resources for housing out there as well.
And moving back towards economic development, how would you differentiate between developing tourism and placemaking in rural communities?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, there's duplication in all of the strategies that were laid out. I mean, so whether we're looking at rural rising strategies or the Aspen Institute, or many of the rural focus, there's a lot of overlap. So certainly if you have sort of a recreational economy, there are several localities in Virginia that actually it's a natural inclination. I mean, they have the resources to actually have like four-wheelers and recreational vehicles and things of that nature, environmentally friendly, that to come out to some of the rural areas and give individuals an experience of just being out riding through the countryside. You could build your assets around rivers or lakes, streams, water sources, but also around your artists. I mean, you look at Floyd County, it's really a mecca for the artists, artisans there. So, you can look at, the assets and the resources of people, or you can look at the natural assets, or, again, man-made. I mean, whatever will give you the opportunity to lure people to come to your locality. And there are just a lot of creative people across Virginia and across the country on how to utilize the resources and the assets that they have to get people to come to their community. Because, I mean, what is tourism, I mean, that is actually an export. I mean, you have people coming to your area and leaving money there. So it really is, it's not people coming there and taking your jobs and taking things. They're coming there and leaving economic development behind. So a lot of great, certainly in Southwest Virginia, a lot of great ideas, a lot of innovative projects. And again, I know your question was, is there a difference between, the placemaking and, but it's not. I mean, so, placemaking is you really want to make your place as livable and friendly and welcoming as possible, which is very similar to tourism and having a recreational infrastructure.
I think relatedly, we had someone in the chat ask about the Main Street America program, suggesting that lots of rural Americans don't agree with some of its practices, and wondering how we can convince folks that Main Street programs benefit everyone. Has that been your experience?
Well, it has not been my experience. I've heard, we get a lot of feedback when you work in communities. I mean, it's their communities. We go in, we listen to communities, and it's not for any agency or outside organization to tell the folks in that community how they should think or what they should, want. But the Main Street program is an outstanding program. I mean, really, you can highlight, because again, that's what this country grew out of. I mean, we used to have, little, mom and pop shops on Main Street in your little town. And so, in a lot of areas and counties, you still have, that infrastructure there. And actually in a lot of places, you still have, several businesses on your main street, and some main streets are thriving, many are thriving. And so what we're, with the Main Street program that's again run through Department of Housing and Community Development, is that, again, they come in and provide the technical assistance and help localities think about things that could be beneficial to their locality. And so I've always seen it as, working together with localities and really having the Main Street blossom and bloom and grow. Every now and then, I mean, just like any type of relationship, you may have differences of opinion, but in the end, the Main Street program, I can't say enough positive things about it. And it's really designed to just help the localities achieve their goals. And so, I mean, I'm all in favor of the Main Street program, but certainly happy to listen to any concerns people may have around that.
We had another question about crime, saying crime is highest in urban settings, but crime, in particularly drug-related crime, has increased significantly in rural areas. And this is a problem because there's fewer resources, such as drug rehab and crime prevention. And what are some rural development steps underway to address crime and drug use in rural settings?
Right. There's no crime in rural areas. Yeah, no. So we're crime free there. But seriously, there are issues. There are issues with drug abuse. There are issues across the country. And so again, rural areas aren't immune from these situations. I just recently, less than a month ago, one of my best workers on my farm passed away from a drug overdose. He actually, and that was, very impactful on our community because he was such a stalwart in our community. But, unfortunately, opioids, there's a significant addiction problem in rural America, but also, again, across America. So certainly we need to invest in the resources to help, because this is a disease. This is an addiction. We need mental health resources. We need more counseling. We need more beds to actually provide the needed health care. Certainly around drug abuse, and it's not just opioids. I mean, you have alcoholism and other comorbidity. I mean, mental health issues that go undiagnosed. Not only again in rural areas, but across the state and the country as well. So far more resources need to go into, and certainly you could see that these were exacerbated from the pandemic, where, again, there was a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And certainly in rural areas, you have a lot of stress and anxiety among farmers, among people who actually, are trying to figure how to deal with the rising fertilizer and input costs. And, so again, we need more resources, and thankfully there are programs. There are programs certainly through USDA and through the state as well to help mitigate some of that, but not enough resources at all.
Mm-hmm. I think it's 12:55, so we're going to have to ask our last question here. There's been a lot of good ones, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I will put as the last one. Are there programs that address transportation infrastructure issues in rural Virginia, or will it continue to be a very car-dependent place to live?
Right. Yeah. Transportation. I mean, transportation infrastructure. That is a very complex, very complicated set of issues to address. We need to have connectivity, far more connectivity between our metropolitan areas, our urban centers, and our rural, whether it's by rail, which is again one of the least expensive ways to actually commute. But again, there are trade-offs because there are some localities that they don't want any trains. They don't want any rails coming to their localities. But transportation, going to your larger question, Mike, transportation, very, very tough to really unwind, but we need that type of thinking. Here's the thing, there's no problem too hard for folks to get behind and find a solution to, whether it's transportation. And certainly there are a lot of issues with transportation, whether, again, we talked about, the electric vehicles, or, just many ways that we can commute. Because what in the end, I think what we will find, and what we already know is that there are far more similarities between rural folks and urban folks and metropolitan folks. We all have the same wishes, goals, and desires to, leave things better for our kids than we found them. And so we all want that. So again, there's a lot of similarity. I hear a lot about the urban rural divide. I mean, really, people are people, whether you live in a rural place or an urban place. And so, again, the more we can connect with each other, I think the better off not only the Commonwealth of Virginia, but the United States will be as well. So, but yeah, we need to work on that transportation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gooden, for joining us for this great discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you to Dean Gooden and Dr. Gooden for a great program. So many great things being discussed there. And I hope all our attendees enjoyed. We will send out a quick feedback and follow-up, which will include today's presentation, and that'll give you a chance to marinate on it a little bit more. So without further ado, please save the date for our next Lunch and Learn on September 21st, titled Preparing for School Safety, Virginia as a National Model, with our speaker, Donna Michaelis, seen here, Director of the Division of Public Safety Training and Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety at the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. And with that said, we look forward to seeing you all then, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.